Hey guys, welcome to BP the Bible Perspective. False equivalence. Debunking Thomas Sowell's objection to slave reparations. Now before we get into it, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I want to talk about debunking Thomas Sowell here. Thomas Sowell is one of the patriarchs of black conservatives. Now, what do I mean by black conservatives? The black conservative movement, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but there is a growing movement of conservatism, some good and some not so good. Some of the newer faces that's probably more out in the media, Candace Owens, Jesse Lee Peters, Larry Elders, and they're kind of a anyway. But some of your kind of old school conservatives, Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, okay, Clarence Thomas, Justice Clarence Thomas, Shelby Steele, Armstrong Williams, just to name a few, okay? And they're not monolithic, so there are different, just like in any kind of class or group, you have different people for different things. Candace Owens, arguably you could say, is she even really a real conservative? I'm not here to debate that. But when you go back into the, excuse me, like 70s and 80s, basically you had people like Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams. Okay, I think Walter Williams has since passed away earlier this year. So they would probably been the ones out more in the forefront of the media. Okay. And here's my thing. I'm not necessarily here to judge the black conservative movement. I think today, in order to get media attention, audiences, there are statements and positions that they take that are just to favor not so much as conservative principles, because we can even talk about that. What are conservative principles? But their positions, of course, favor white point of views. So they tend to dismiss the realities of racism, the effect of slavery, okay? Now, as I said, conservatism, and it shouldn't be confused with biblical principles, and that's where a lot of Christians try to intersect. Conservative principles is one thing, biblical principles is another. Conservative principles may certainly have certain principles from the Bible, but the conservative principles is more an ideology that is rooted in culture, white culture at that, okay? Now, the fact that there are Christians who would say, I am a conservative, and as I said, they try to intersect certain principles, okay? Certain principles. Excuse me. Biblical principles kind of merge. They don't do a good job of it. But that's another video. What I want to kind of unpack here is Thomas Sowell, again, who was one of the patriarchs of the black conservatives. And in this interview, he talks about reparations. But I want to kind of talk about how he talks about it, the false equivalency of how he kind of puts this together. So let's unpack his video along the way.
Tom, reparations. We began by talking about disparate impact, the idea that discrimination is so deeply embedded in the American experience that it can take.
Okay, now I want you to notice what he said, that the racism is so embedded in the American experience. Now, he's not going to answer that question. I want to kind of bring that out, because it is an integral part of the conversation. America, from its birth, the birth defect was racism, but it was on purpose. So when you have Thomas Jefferson, and listen to these words here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, that's what Thomas Jefferson wrote. Okay. So this was the Constitution of the United States. The question is, how then can a country that's founded on this have slaves? I want you to keep that in mind, because this is what the false equivalency is built upon. Not talking about this. So when conservatives today say there ain't no racism, what racism? Oh, racism. My question is, when did we change from this? Further, in order to have slavery, so if you start off with this concept, with this ideology, how then do you then have slaves? If you say all men are created equal, how do you have slaves then, right? You have to condition the minds of people to accept this, both slave and free. You have to say, let's disregard the application of this statement. Let's disregard it. And then you have to further say that a certain amount of people are not equal to us, meaning Caucasian. They are inferior. They are not humans. So when you talk about the 3/5 compromise, it was a political stunt. The southern states, in order to gain representation, said, hey, let's count our Negroes. The North came along and said, hold up, they're slaves, they're property. You can't count them. So the argument goes back. The compromise was, okay, 3/5. We account 3/5. So in the end, the slaves still won the argument, because if you start off with not being able to count them because they're property and you consider them not human, to be able to count 3/5 of them, pretty good. So just hypothetically, instead of 10 slaves, how about we get to count 7 slaves? They still won. The point is that we're counting them as 3/5 of humans. This was embedded in the minds and hearts of Americans. So the question is, when did that change? So in 1865, the bloodiest war fought on American soil freed slaves. But did it change minds and hearts? Well, you had another 100 years of legal segregation. So again, how do we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So at the end of slavery in 1865, slaves are free. Did white people think of slaves this way? They were free. And by the way, when I say white people, not all white people, because equally there were whites who fought always on the abolition side, the civil rights side, so forth and so on. So we are referring to those whites who held and hold to the racist ideologies. That's what we're referring to. So when did their mindsets change? And also in the church, most sadly of all, because remember, The biblical mandate is higher than that. So how can a Christian church, evangelical church, one where Jesus said, let me quote one. I'm going to bring this up right quick. Because this is important here. Let me just say, this is John 13. John chapter 13. Now, this is the Christian church. This is Jesus' command to his people. And let's see if the Christian church, doing slavery, doing Jim Crow, lived up to this. This is Jesus speaking. I give you a new command. Love one another. Just as I have loved you, you must also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. Did the Christian church fulfill that? Southern Baptist? How about Bob Jones University? How about Assemblies of God? How about Churches of Christ? How about every single denomination? Did they obey this? No, they did not. So again, it was embedded in the minds and hearts of people, racism. And this is why you could have slavery and then followed by another 100 years of Jim Crow. So in 1965, did white people changed? Okay, so let's keep that in mind. Let's continue.
Even in the absence of an intention to discriminate. So this argument, which is that there's some basic flaw or sin that's still with us, comes up in the case for reparations.
Now, let me say about reparations, because he said the sin or flaw in us. Now, he uses the word sin, by the way. And that's interesting to me that he would say that he would use the word sin. Well, if you're going to say sin, let's use God's standard by saying when someone commits wrong, should they make right the wrong? Reparations is about making right what America has done. And let me just say this about reparations, that there are people who, even if the Congress and the Senate came back and said, we're going to pay reparations, but only 1 penny. 1 penny. And let's say this. Let's say if they said we're going to pay 1 penny collectively to all the African Americans, to all the slaves throughout the history of America, there were people out of hatred that would still oppose even that. So this is deeper. The objections to reparations, it's deeper, the very root of racism itself that was embedded. So the question becomes, did America do wrong? And then the other question is, have they made right that wrong? According to their own standards. How about according to biblical standards, but according to their own standards, have they made that right? Now, so if you buy a business, one of the things that your lawyers are supposed to check out is, are there pending lawsuits, pending litigation? Because if you buy it without addressing that, you inherit that. And let me just also say this, that you won't hear him talk about, is why were slave owners paid reparations? The Japanese were paid reparations. Even the Jews were given money for the Holocaust, and America had nothing to do with that. The only people that they have a problem with paying reparations to is African Americans. Why? Because of the deep-rooted hatred that was embedded. You had to have that in order to enslave people. Let's continue.
Longish quotation, but it sets something up. But from Ta-Nehisi Coates in an article in The Atlantic entitled "The Case for Reparations." White supremacy is not merely the work of hot-headed demagogues, but a force so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine the country without it. And so we must imagine a new country. Reparations is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. The wealth gap merely puts a number on something we feel but cannot say, that American prosperity was ill-gotten and selective in its distribution. What I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustices. What I'm talking about is a...
Now, up until this point, I agree with him. What he's saying is true, and from a biblical standpoint, would this not be true? Now, the rest of it, let's hear it.
National reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. Close quote.
Now, this spiritual renewal stuff, now, reparations is about one thing and one thing only. Making right what was done wrong. That's it. I don't care about how people think about it. I don't care about how sometimes, for some reason, a lot of times Black Americans want apologies. I don't care about apologies. The reparations itself is about simply making right what was done wrong. Okay.
And Tom Sowell makes what of that?
Well, it tells me that I've made the right decision not to read the Atlantic for decades. Slavery is a very big subject. I have in my home an entire bookcase of books about slavery in various parts of the world and various times of history.
And then here is the false equivalency. Agreed, slavery was a part of human history as a Christian, the sinful nature. If you were a weaker person, a weaker community, you probably was going to be a slave. But that's the false equivalency of America. So that, and if you notice that he's not talking about America.
And the sad fact is that slavery has been a universal institution for thousands of years, as far back as you can trace human history. And what we're looking at is if slavery is something that happened to one race of people in one country.
Well, that's all we should talk about. America. So if you want to say that America is just like all of those other nations, especially the ones in Africa, you go back in history how cruel and brutal other slave-holding nations and empires were. And if you're going to say that America is just like those, then you can't say America the Great, can you? You can't say America was better. America was on a higher moral plane. You're saying America was just like those wicked pagan nations before her.
When in fact the spread of it was around the world. In 1776, which is when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, as well as when the United States got started, he said that Western Europe is the only place in the world where there is no slavery.
Is that true? Really? Seem to think colonialism come into place here, but okay, let's continue.
And even the Western Europeans had vast numbers of slaves in the Western Hemisphere,
yes,
but not in Western Europe itself. And so if you're going to have reparations for slavery, it's going to be the greatest transfer of wealth back and forth, and between and cross-hauling, as they say in the railroads, because the number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that.
Again, so here's a false equivalence. We're not talking about Africa. Unless you're saying that America is on the same level as those African nations. Let's let him finish.
Together. I know, but nobody is going to North Africa to ask for reparations because nobody is going to be fool enough to give it to them. Here we have intellectuals who can imagine a different history from the rest of the world, even though it's so similar to the rest of the world.
So let's close off with this. He says that no one is going to go to Africa. Who said, why should we go to Africa? How can Americans hold Africans, right? And notice he mentions Africa. And notice he takes the time to mention the barbarity of Africa, but not the barbarity of America. See, we're talking about American that's supposed to be different, that claim to be different, superior, more spiritual than any other nation on the planet. Let me read it again. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what other nation has made this claim of freedom? What other nation? Now let me also read one other verse of scripture before we go, because this is Jesus saying this verse here in John chapter 13, when he says, I give you a new command, love one another just as I have loved you. You must also love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. I want to read that again. Now listen. How does America then? Is America just like the pagan wicked nations? Or aren't we supposed to be better based upon those two phrases? Aren't we supposed to be better? See, the false equivalency is to deflect from America. And that's what Dr. Sowell is doing here. If you notice, he's not talking about the cruelty of America. You know, in some of his other lectures he does. But in this clip, notice he deflects from and try to say, oh, you know, American slavery just like everybody else. And the point is, so in this area of slavery, we should not be held to a higher standard. Wrong. America was wrong. And the idea was that, to me, a lot of the black conservatives wanted to augment the white guilt, dismiss the white guilt, lighten the cruelty, lighten the impact. Thus, when you talk about reparations from a Christian's perspective, how does God feel about that? How does God, the perversion that people try to use on scripture to say, oh, we shouldn't pay the people, our own people that we wronged. We shouldn't pay them. We shouldn't pay them reparations. Now, we can pay people that are not of our nation. We could pay others. We could even pay slave masters reparations, but not the victims themselves. That is the hypocrisy of America, and that is the false equivalency that Sowell is perpetuating here. That is my perspective, guys. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comments section below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. See you in the next video.